Before I begin my final talk, presentation, whatever noun you want to use to describe what I'm sharing with you today, I want to share excerpts of a letter from John Adams to his wife, Abigail Adams. You recall in one of my previous talks, I promoted this book, My Dearest Friend, Letters of Abigail and John Adams. This letter is dated on my birthday, July 3rd, but July 3rd, 1776. Here's a preface statement. On July 2nd, Congress finally adopted a resolution in favor of independence, and on July 4th, approved the Declaration of Independence. John sat on the committee appointed to draft the document and had himself encouraged Thomas Jefferson to write the original draft, which was accepted with some modifications. As is typical of John Adams, he recognized the historical significance of the event, but was just slightly off in his analysis of how it would be remembered. He was convinced that America would always celebrate July 2nd as the most memorable epoch in the history of America. So this is what he wrote to his wife, a portion of the letter. But the day is past. The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward and forevermore. You think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I'm well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in the day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. So we do celebrate July 4th, not July 2nd, as the day of commemoration, but he wanted to really name it the Day of Deliverance. I like that. A great anniversary festival. And I wanted to share that with you because of all the hoopla on July 4th about this is not my America and wanting to choose a different date and time for the Declaration of Independence for African Americans. But I share in my heart what John Adams felt as he wrote to his wife. The Declaration of Independence, a brave act, needs to be commemorated and made a big deal of. And just like the fathers in Israel on the day of Passover sat down and reviewed, why do we celebrate this day? Because we were being delivered. So we ought to sit down with our children on July 4th and explain to them what this is all about and why it's important to remember. Mission Impossible. Major George Beckwith, British intelligence officer, 1782 to 1783. Washington did not really outfight the British. He simply outspied us. quote from General George Washington. Quote from a Central Intelligence Agency document. George Washington was more deeply involved in intelligence operations than any general-in-chief until Dwight David Eisenhower during World War II. And I didn't know until I did research that George Washington was a spy for the British during the French and Indian War. So he did have some background in the importance of gathering intelligence. The Americans would not have won the Revolutionary War without the use of what is called intelligence or spies, as sinister as that sounds, and particularly the Culper spy ring. Washington's underground spy network is full of intrigue, letters written in invisible ink, a rare female agent who went by the moniker Agent 355. What was James Bond's number? 007. And the gruesome execution of the spy, Nathan Hale. From the beginning of Washington's military career, intelligence gathering helped in its shaping. He first learned to use on-the-ground information from Native Americans and deserting French soldiers during the French and Indian War. Intelligence, he learned, could make the difference between victory and death. When the Second Continental Congress chose Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he chose Thomas Knowlton to organize the war's first spy unit, Knowlton's Rangers. A 130-man group played a key role in the Battle of Harlem Heights in New York, scouting out the British advance guard. Sadly, Knowlton was killed by musket fire during this battle. The seal of the United States Army Intelligence Service bears a 1776 stamp in honor of Knowlton's unit. In November of 1778, a new appointment was made as Director of Military Intelligence, Benjamin Talmadge. Washington gave him specific orders to construct a spy ring inside New York City, which was occupied by the British. Furthermore, he did not want to know their names or any personal information. Totally secret. The spy's contribution included uncovering a British counterfeiting scheme, preventing an ambush of French reinforcements, smuggling a British naval code book to Yorktown, preventing Benedict Arnold from carrying out his treacherous plan to surrender West Point to the enemy. Code names were used to hide the identities of the operatives. Even Washington had a code name. He was Agent 711. Not the store. A Culper code book was created, which assigned ciphers to 763 names or words. 219 equaled gun. 223 equaled gold. 701 signified woman, and 355 signified lady. Major Benjamin Talmadge, center and military leader of the spy ring. Ordinary citizens, he said. Ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things.
It's interesting that a lot of these men were actually childhood friends.
Yes,
Friends from
or
childhood.
neighbors.
Abraham Woodhull, interestingly enough, was a cabbage farmer. His father was the mayor of the town where they lived, who was also a Tory. And he was very conflicted. He kind of knew what his son was doing, and he was conflicted.
So ordinary citizens: Robert Townsend, Abraham Woodhull, Austin Rowe, Caleb Brewster, James Rivington, and Agent 355. Together, these 5 men and 1 woman broke the back of the British military and helped defeat the most powerful fighting force on earth. Robert Townsend. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, British harassment of his family, and his friendship with Abraham Woodhull were contributing factors of Robert Townsend becoming part of the spy ring. One of his most valuable discoveries concerned a play by the British to flood the country with counterfeit money. He warned his superiors of spies in their midst, and he helped to use information of British intentions to spread disinformation to the British in order to keep them occupied while the French were able to safely land their forces. His final report to George Washington including this closing remark, quote, "I never saw such distress and dissatisfaction in my life as is painted in the countenance of every Tory in New York." So, your facial expression reveals a lot. But that was in his final report. In New York, every Tory, general distress and dissatisfaction when the war was won. He took his culprit identity, though, to the grave. It was only discovered in 1930 by a New York historian by the name of Morton Pennypacker. Abraham Woodhull used the alias Samuel Culper Sr. and was one of the leading members of the spy ring in New York City. His military career was brief, serving only a few months as lieutenant in the Suffolk County, New York militia in the fall of 1775. He resigned, motivated by the murder of his cousin, Brigadier General Nathaniel Woodhull. His cousin had been wounded by sword and bayonet cuts after being captured in 1776. He was deprived of medical care and food and died an agonizing death a month later. Abraham was incensed against the British by this event, but did not immediately begin spying for the network. He was the only surviving son of aging parents, and he stayed on the family farm to take care of his family and their property. His neighbor was Major Benjamin Talmadge. Now, if you recall, I just said Major Benjamin Talmadge was selected by George Washington to head the spy network. His neighbor was Benjamin Talmadge, who we know is being appointed by General Washington. As cover for his participation in the secret spy ring, he swore an oath to the British Crown as cover. His plan was to travel to Manhattan on the ruse of visiting his married sister, Mary Underhill, and her husband, who owned a boarding house. Any information gathered while on these trips came from various sources, including British officers who stayed at the boarding house, and as he roamed the streets of Manhattan collecting other information. So, he would return then to Setauket, pass the information on to Caleb Brewster, a whaleboat operator, and Caleb would ferry the information to Talmadge. And Talmadge would then send the information to General Washington. It's kind of like tag, you're it. Suspicion was cast upon Abraham, though, because of his frequent trips to visit his sister. They thought that quite unusual. And the other suspicion was that he didn't spend a lot of time visiting his sister. He was roaming the streets collecting information, visiting shops, coffee houses, listening in to conversations whenever he could. So suspicion was cast upon him, and his life was in danger. So, the new plan for delivering information was to change who was the main courier. So that's when Austin Roe became that courier, who conveyed information by using a dead drop location, burying letters in a box in a pasture that he rented on Woodhull's property. Austin Roe, Agent 724. a tavern owner. He served the spy ring primarily as a courier, traveling the 55-mile trip on horseback to retrieve the dispatches for Robert Townsend. These trips down Long Island to the city put him in grave danger. Once the American forces were driven out of Manhattan, or out of that area, law and order suffered. Much of the island became a military British camp, and the residents were placed under martial law. Corruption, abuses against civilians, and property was commonly perpetrated. Thank you. Roe risked the gallows if caught, and he did not want to wind up like Nathan Hale, who was discovered securing intelligence and immediately hanged. It was Roe who brought information via Samuel Culper Jr. that the British Navy was planning an ambush of the French fleet at Rhode Island. So Washington took that information, produced a phony battle plan to seize the city of New York, news which he had planted behind enemy lines. And when the British heard about these battle plans, the general recalled the forces to New York to protect New York, to repel an attack that would not come. And therefore the French could land safely on American shores. Caleb Brewster, member of the Secret Six, which, by the way, led to the beginning of the Secret Service that we know today. This Culper spy ring laid the groundwork for what we know now as the Secret Service. Brewster was the link between Connecticut and Long Island, moving across the Sound in his whaleboats at least once a week. Now, a woman named Nancy Strong was aware of his landing areas, and she would hang her intimate apparel, they called it back then, her petticoats, on her clothesline. She would hang a black petticoat and one of 6 handkerchiefs on her clothesline to denote the number associated with the landing places where Talmadge could meet Brewster. Using naval guerrilla warfare, he navigated the waters to attack a ship much larger than his small rowboat, or he could avoid detection. He made several trips attacking British shipping vessels and carrying messages back to Talmadge to deliver to Washington. He was in every raiding party that ever took place on Long Island. He was described as being tall in stature, possessing a keen wit and an unrivaled sense of humor. I think you would have to have a sense of humor to do some of the things that he did. After the war, he married, worked as a farmer and a blacksmith, before returning to naval service as a captain to the government ship in charge of preventing smuggling. Caleb Brewster was part of organizing the predecessor to what is now known as the United States Coast Guard. James Rivington, Patriot spy or loyalist, double agent? No one is really sure about the heart and intent of this man. He owned a coffee shop that was close to his printing office, and Samuel Culper Jr., i.e. Robert Townsend, helped to finance this coffee shop because it's where British officers like to come and drink their coffee and have conversation. Robert Townsend would pretend to be a reporter for the newspaper that James Rivington printed. And so he would sit, drink coffee, muck it up with these British officers, get information as he could. Because British officers like to hang out there, the information through gossip and conversation was available. Rivington also published and sold books. His coffee shop was near his printing office. So secret papers were hidden inside the book covers of books, and the books were sold to spies who delivered these books to George Washington. Agent 355, female spy in the American Revolution. This lady's identity is still unknown, and historians still debate as to who she really was. She might have escaped imprisonment and gone on to live a happy long life. Or she might have passed away on the British ship HMS Jersey, which the British abandoned in the harbor with several thousand starving prisoners of war still on board. Agent 355 may have been a reference to several women who operated under that code name. However, she did exist. She was a real, living, breathing woman who sacrificed her safety and perhaps her life for the sake of our country. The Secret Six, George Washington's Culper spy ring. For years, the only Revolutionary War spy immortalized in history books was the brave and ultimately unsuccessful Nathan Hale. Whose immortal words, who remembers them?
Give me liberty or put me dead.
Or no, I regret that I have one life to give for my country.
I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. The thing about the extra danger of being a spy is that if you were caught by the British, you were immediately executed. You might get a short trial, declared guilty, and hung. So some of the spies, there were a couple of ones not in the Culper spy ring that were successful in being couriers of information. One in particular made sure he had a scrap of clothing of one of the Continental soldiers' uniforms on him. So if he were captured, he would be captured as a prisoner of war, not as a spy. And therefore, the chances of him surviving, escaping, or being released was definitely greater than being executed as a spy. So they thought up some of these different elusive ways of protecting themselves. Nathan Hale, arrested, knew he was going to die, knew up front that if caught, he would be executed. He asked for a Bible to read in his final hours. He was denied. He asked for his pastor to come and pray with him. It was denied. He did receive pen and paper where he could write a letter to his parents. But all of those comforting things that we offer people in prison right before they go on death row was denied to him. He could not have the comfort of his pastor or the comfort of his Bible with him. The Secret Six was relegated to being just a local legend. When people told stories about the Culper spy ring, it was, well, could be one of those war stories. Until 1929, when historian Morton Pennypacker was given a wagon full of Townsend letters that the Townsend family members were cleaning out the attic and found these boxes, wooden crates, trunks of letters. Most of them were ledgers of what he sold and when. But in the ledgers, Pennypacker discovered, oh, on such and such date we know when Talmadge was in town, because he stopped at the shop and it's recorded in the letter, in his ledger, that Talmadge was there, that he purchased something, and that type of thing. So they were able to trace then through his ledger that Robert Townsend was actually one of the Secret Six, and from there began to put the puzzle pieces together of the Culper spy ring. The history of this spy ring is taught as part of the introductory training for new agents of the CIA. Their methods of dead drops, well-crafted backstories, secret encrypted code are the same methods used today by secret agents. They even had James J., brother to John Jay, who was part of the Continental Congress, invented a chemical invisible ink, because they had invisible ink, usually made with onion juice, vinegar, and you hold it over a flame and you can see it. But he developed this chemical invisible ink that you had to have a regent in order to make the writing appear. So in some of these books sent to George Washington, where information was in hidden pages, some of those blank pages were actually written with that chemical ink. They learned to write with invisible ink in between lines of books or other letters. So they had a real complicated and pretty secure way. However, the chemical ink was in small supply, so they hoarded it and was very careful with it because it was difficult to make and difficult to get to them.
There was another method that they used with eggs, where they could take a hard-boiled egg, and I forget what combination of ingredients they would use, but they could write on the shell of the egg, and it would go through the shell and appear on the white of the egg. So when you peel the egg, there was the message on the egg.
Some little messages were hidden in buttons of the uniforms, because the buttons were brass buttons with backs that popped off, and tiny little messages were put in buttons. And that was one way, like in a city, where messages could be passed around. Very clever and creative. The culprits worked in profound secrecy. That was the deciding factor before anybody decided to join up with Benjamin Talmadge in his spy ring. Each one of these men made the major promise that their names and identities would never be known, even to General Washington. And that was a promise that was kept. They worked in profound secrecy, never sought recognition after the war, never received any accolades after the war, never revealed the risks they took or the sacrifices they made to serve our country. They served a newborn country against a military that was considered to be unbeatable. To offset British superiority in firepower and number of troops, George Washington made frequent use of deceptiveness and misinformation and disinformation. I'll give you some examples. Washington had fake military facilities built to make the British believe that his 3,000-man army outside of Philadelphia was 40,000 strong. So he was giving the British misinformation here. He built these ramparts and he hid cannons and whatever, so that the British thought that 3,000 men were really 40,000. Propaganda was used to discourage the hired mercenaries, the Hessians. 5,000 to 6,000 Hessians deserted from the British side during the war as a result of this propaganda. And Benjamin Franklin had a role in that. He had packets of tobacco made and messages inside the packages of tobacco that told the Hessians if they deserted the British and come to the side of the Patriots, they were promised land, that they would own, would be given land out west, but that they would be given land. And so 5,000 to 6,000 of them took up the offer, And so these packets of tobacco were distributed throughout any area where known Hessian troops were located. Just, you think of them airdropping leaflets, over in Iran and all this. Well, of course we couldn't airdrop the tobacco packets, but Benjamin Franklin had ways to see that these packets of tobacco with that propaganda inside were delivered to the Hessian army. A quarter, 1/4 of George Washington's military budget was spent on intelligence. That's how important he felt it was to winning the war. He demanded, and this is emphasized, and I've read parts of his letters, he demanded effective counterintelligence. Quote, "The one evil I dread, and that is their spies." So he was very strict about those who pretended to be spies and acted as spies for the American Revolution in order to get monetary reward. He would have them investigated, put on trial, and their lives made miserable. Washington did not really outfight the British, he just simply outspied them. And as a result of this effective spying, the American Revolution was won and our nation born, and even the British recognized that. Character that defined the American Revolution through the lives of patriots. Benjamin Talmadge said to Abraham Woodhull, quote, "I know that no matter what mask you wear in public right now, this war must be won for the sake of human dignity." Our founding fathers argued that the citizenry's commitment to living a life of character was the key in the success or failure of this Republican experiment. Thomas Jefferson said, and I quote, "The steady character of our countrymen is a rock. The steady character of our countrymen is a rock to which we may safely moor. It is the manners and spirit of a people which preserve a republic in vigor. A degeneracy in these is a canker which soon eats at the heart of its laws and constitution." So Thomas Jefferson saw a degeneracy in character is like a canker that destroys the manner and spirit of a people, its laws and constitution. We see that now. The lack of character in these people who, number one, want to run our country, want to be elected or re-elected, and then we see the lack of character in their supporters and people on the street who say that they have a noble cause of fighting for Black Lives Matters and Antifa and whatever other false statement they want to give to burn and destroy. It's a canker, and it's eating at the heart of our laws and our Constitution. James Madison wrote, "Is there virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure if there is no virtue. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any form of virtue is a false idea." Unquote. James Madison. The founders rightly saw that without a people of character, there could be no trust, no justice, no community, no stability, no true pursuit of happiness. What we see on the news, what we hear from such people as Nancy Pelosi and her cohorts, is evidence that we are living in a nature of characterless people in whom we cannot trust, who execute no justice, offer no stability, and want to steal our true pursuit of happiness. I end up licking my finger anyway. We see the attraction of personality rather than character. Why else would Hollywood be paid to promote a liberal agenda? People are attracted nowadays not by the true character of a person, but by their personality. Let character define you. And we can only hope for the day when character will return and define America.